Russia and Ukraine have been at war for about a month now, just over a month. It's been one of Europe's largest wars since World War II. It's claimed the lives of thousands. It's had millions of people flee and find refuge elsewhere. It really is disastrous. And the question that I've been wondering pretty much since the beginning is, why? Why did Russia invade Ukraine to begin with? Why is all of this happening? Now, it's a complicated question, and there are a lot of moving parts, and I don't really claim to be able to do justice to the answer to that question, but at least part of the question comes down to who has a rightful claim to the land? Who has a rightful claim to the land? One source has said that since World War II, Europe's map has been shaped by political alliances. But now Putin wants to redraw Europe's map by force. And it's not hard to see why. In his view of history, the way that he understands things and the way that he would tell the story, Ukraine belongs to Russia. It always has. The way that, in his own words, modern Ukraine was entirely created by Russia. That's the way that he sees things. That's his perspective. That's the way that he's answering the question and what gives rise to what he is doing, at least in part. I do acknowledge that there are other factors and it's more complicated than that. But the question is not a new one. Certainly not for Russia and Ukraine. They've sort of been at it on and off for about a century. But also just generally as an explanation behind so many conflicts in the world. One nation or one people group believes that they have a claim on a piece of land, that it rightfully belongs to them because of the story that they tell, the way that they understand the story, the way that they interpret history. But another group tells the story in a different way. They see things in a different light, and so conflict happens. This is a situation there in the background of our passage this morning as well. If you were with us for the series that we did late last year, One Big Story, where we looked at the sweep of the entire Bible story from beginning to end, the book of Malachi was written in the post-exilic period. It was after the people had come back from exile in Babylon. The thing to remember is that when the Babylonians swept in at the end of 2 Kings, that's how the end of 2 Kings ends, by the way, if you weren't with us. The Babylonians sweep in and they conquer Jerusalem, and they took the elite of society back home with them. They took them home to work in their own cities, to build up their own empire, to make use of their skills for their own benefit. But they didn't take everybody. If they weren't useful enough, they just got left behind. Sometime later, the Persians took over as the main superpower over the region. They conquered the Babylonians. Conquered might be a bit of a strong word, actually, but we won't get into that today. The Babylonians, the priests were ticked off enough with the emperor that when the Persians came in, they just sort of handed it over. They were just like, you know what? Fine, it's yours. But anyway, the Persians were now in charge, and they had a very different approach to things, where the Babylonians would take people captive, build up their own empire, and leave the rest to just, do what they want back home. The Persians they saw themselves as the great peacemakers of the region. As far as they were concerned, a happy captive is a good captive. And so what they did was they allowed everybody to go home. They allowed everybody to resettle in their homelands, to rebuild, to reconstitute their cults and their temples, and to live at home again. You can read about the story of the Israelites doing that, or at least the people from Judah doing that in Ezra, Nehemiah, and the book of Haggai. To be sure, Persia was still in control. They weren't just letting people go free. They weren't like, okay, cool, well, we've had enough of this captivity thing, you guys can just go home now. They were still in control. They still expected taxes to be paid, and if there were any uprisings, they would clamp down quite strongly. But for all intents and purposes, they were allowed to have a degree of freedom and to live comfortably at home. Now, this raises a difficult question for the people here in our passage for today. The Jews go home. bearing in mind that they haven't been in the land for a generation or two. They've been in exile in Babylon. They've been away from home. Some of them have never even seen the place. And they get back, and they meet a whole lot of people who've never been in exile, who never left. And so it raises the question, whose land is it? You can kind of see it both ways. For the one group, they never left. This was always home. It always has been. The other has been sent home by God to take back the land that was theirs, promised to them by God. They believe that they've been sent back home by God to resettle. Now, to be fair, it isn't all as tidy as this. There are more factors at play. There's more going on. But this is at least part of, or at least in a nutshell, what was going on in Malachi's day. This is the sort of situation on the ground. This is some of the confusion that's going on, some of the sort of things that they're trying to wrap their heads around. There's this looming question about who has the rightful claim to the land. The problem was that amidst all this, there were men in the community, in the Jewish community, the community that came home from exile, who were sent home by God to repopulate the land. And there were men in that community who were leaving their wives, men from that community that came home, and intermarrying with the people who were there. People who perhaps never left the land, people who were from the nations around. They were intermarrying with them. We'll have a think as we move through the passage why this was such a problem. But on a surface level, I think you can probably already guess. With such loaded questions about which group and who has a rightful claim to the land, and related to that, who were actually the people of God, with questions like that hanging in the air, intermarrying with the nations around would only have complicated things further. Think of things like inheritance rights. Think of things like who now has a claim on it if we're now joined in some way. And bear in mind, they also didn't think that they could just share. It was really a case of, well, whose is it? So that's what's sort of framing the issue when we come to our passage. The passage breaks up into two sections, so that's just how we're going to be looking at it today. We've got two issues that Malachi wants to address. The first two related issues, it comes down to the same thing, but he frames it in two kind of sub-points. Their intermarriage with foreigners and their treatment of their own wives. So let's look first at their intermarriage with foreigners. Look at verse 10. Do we not all have one Father? Did not one God create us? Why have we acted treacherously, a man with his brother, so as to defile the covenant of our fathers? Look at the emphasis there. Do we not all have one Father? That could be a reference to God. It could be a reference to one of the patriarchs, like somebody like Jacob or Abraham, probably Jacob, but either way, the point seems to be the same. We are people of the covenant. We have a common history. We have a common heritage. We've got the promises of God binding us together and giving us our identity. And one of those promises, you'll remember from Genesis 12, was for the land. Remember, they'd just come back from exile. They already had to do business with the fact that they'd screwed this up once. They'd already had to do with the fact that God had had enough with them and kicked them out once. Now they're back in the land that God had promised them, but it wasn't a given that they'd be able to hold on to it. Certainly not if they kept going the way that they were. By intermarrying with foreigners, they risked giving ground to these other nations to lay claim to what they saw as rightfully theirs. Now, we're going to come back to this just now and think a little bit more about what that means for us. But before moving on, I think it's worth just clarifying what it doesn't mean. When this passage is not calling us to be Amish. We're not called to live in our holy huddle and not let foreigners in. The problem isn't with foreignness per se, but with what foreignness stood for in their context. What they understood came with it, specifically in their context, not ours. Huge damage is done when we assume that we can just apply what's going on there to what's going on in our setting. That's how apartheid was justified, by jumping too quickly to what's going on in the text to what is going on in our situation today, and not paying enough attention to the details and what should be bridging that movement. So don't mishear me. God has no issue with foreignness. God celebrates diversity, and he wants to see that in society, and he wants to see that in his kingdom. But here in Malachi, there's more at stake. It isn't so much about foreignness as it is what foreignness stood for in the minds of the people. And we'll come back to that, to what that was just now. One of the problems being addressed here, and the second thing that Malachi raises against these people, is what they're doing to their own wives. If the first issue that Malachi raises is intermarriage with foreigners, the second is their treatment of their wives. Pick up at verse 13. This is the second thing you do. You cover the Lord's altar with tears, with weeping, and with groaning, because he no longer regards the offering or accepts it with favor from your hand. But you say, why does he not? Because the Lord was witness between you and the wife of your youth, to whom you have been faithless, though she is your companion and your wife by covenant. These people are shedding all these tears that God isn't accepting their offerings and their sacrifices, a problem that's also addressed elsewhere in the book. But notice what it really comes down to. It isn't just that they've intermarried with foreigners, but they've actually acted treacherously toward their own Jewish wives in order to do so. Now that's an important warning to hear. The people continue to make sacrifices. They continued with their outward displays of worship. And for all intents and purposes, onlookers might have thought, well, actually things look like they're going okay. Like they have it all together. But God isn't interested in any of that if what it comes with is that we don't treat people with the dignity and the worth that they have as his image bearers. From what we can gather, these men divorced their wives for no good reason, leaving them high and dry, and at a time where things weren't exactly prosperous in Judah. You can read about that in Ezra and Nehemiah, or in the book of Haggai. Things weren't exactly easy for them. They left these women to fend for themselves so that they could run off with another who wasn't even from their community. Perhaps for financial gain, as a way of trying to level up in society. And Malachi is having none of it. Look at verse 16. It is divorce without grounds, says Yahweh, the God of Israel, and he covers his clothes with violence, says Yahweh of armies. So guard yourself in your spirit and do not act treacherously. So what does this passage have to say to us today? Well, I don't think we can miss the cry for justice that runs through this passage. A cry for justice for the acts done against the women of this community. And it's a cry that I think we should be hearing today. Just think of the Me Too movement, or the ongoing fight against gender-based violence here in our country, but also elsewhere. As people, but especially as God's people, this should be a major concern to us. There are things we can do. We can support organizations set up to help people who are experiencing gender-based violence. If there's someone that we know in this sort of situation, we can come alongside them, or at the very least, we can point them in the right direction so that they can get the help and the support that we need. But there are smaller, or at least simpler things that we can do. It starts with what we say. It starts with our words. It's dropping crude or sexist jokes. And having the guts to call others out, to challenge others when they're going ahead with it, not just to sort of laugh along or keep quiet. What Malachi shows us is that as Christians, we should have a concern for justice and for the way that women are treated. We should be a prophetic voice, proclaiming to the world, in the words of Amos, we should be proclaiming God's desire to let justice roll on like a river, and righteousness like a never-failing stream. We should be a voice to the world out there of what it looks like to live the way that God wants us to uphold the justice that He wants to see in society. But let's not make the mistake of thinking that it's just something for out there. Let's not make the mistake of thinking that it's just something out there in the world. This is actually a problem that plagues the church too. Just this past week, I read an article about a man in John MacArthur's church who, John MacArthur is a megachurch pastor over in the States. There was a man in his church who was abusing his wife and kids. But when his wife left him and wanted to get a divorce, she was publicly shamed by John MacArthur, called out by name as a sinner in front of the entire church as somebody who's wanting to break up the home and refuses to be reconciled to her husband. She was targeted by the elders of the church. She was put under church discipline. She was ostracized by members of the church community. And she actually went to the church elders first to address the situation, to talk to them and say, listen, this is what's going on. Please help me. And all they did was give him a little slap on the wrist and then tell her that what she needs to do is to grin and bear it for the sake of keeping the family together. That she's the one breaking up the family. In the end, he was arrested. And John MacArthur and his church have yet to say something. They've yet to acknowledge that maybe they were in the wrong. This is not just a problem out there in the world. This is a problem that plagues the church. It's not even just a problem that plagues the church over there, like a big moment, like with a big church, with a famous pastor like John MacArthur. It's something that happens here in South Africa, in Cape Town. I have friends, women who here in South Africa, here in Cape Town, who have experienced this within their churches, from leaders within their churches. It's not something that's just out there, it's something that's in here. Malachi calls us as God's people to have a concern for justice, and it doesn't just start out there or with an organization. Although those things are helpful, although those things deserve our support, it starts in here. It starts with our own hearts. It starts with our own families. It starts with raising our kids to be the sort of people who will uphold justice, particularly men who will stand up and take a stand for justice. That, I think, is a nice segue into the second thing that Malachi has to say to us today. The second major thing that Malachi is concerned with is essentially a question of commitment. Commitment to their wives? Yes. Commitment to justice? Absolutely. But these are born out of a more fundamental commitment to God. That, in one sense, is what this is all about. Just look again at the way that this whole thing is framed. Verse 11, Judah has been unfaithful. A detestable thing has been committed in Israel and in Jerusalem. Judah has desecrated the sanctuary the Lord loves by marrying women who worship a foreign god. That's how it's put in the NIV. If you have an ESV, you'll notice it's worded slightly differently. You'll see that he has married the daughter of a foreign god. Now, not everyone agrees, but I think it's essentially just saying the same thing in different words. But it is an odd way of saying it. The daughter of a foreign god. It is a strange way of saying it. And actually, this is the only place in the Hebrew Bible that we find it said like that. But that, I think, is exactly the point. Malachi isn't just using an unusual phrase for the sake of it. He isn't trying to be edgy or out there. I think he's using it to show us what's at stake, to get at the heart of what the real issue is at the root of all this. And he takes it further in the second half of the passage, I think, adding to it and highlighting it, that this is the issue that's at stake. Look at verse 14. The ESV puts it this way: Yahweh was witness between you and the wife of your youth, to whom you have been faithless, though she is your companion and your wife, by covenant. Which covenant? Well, the way the NIV puts it would seem to suggest that it's the marriage covenant. The problem is that marriage isn't often referred to as a covenant in the Old Testament. I think it's okay for us to see it that way. I think it's right for us to see it that way today. It isn't often spoken about that way in the Old Testament. But it is often used as a metaphor to speak about the covenant between God and Israel in the Old Testament. And you can see why. It comes with all the connotations of commitment and loyalty that we would want to see in a marriage relationship, and applying that to Israel's relationship with God, and that covenant relationship that we're hoping to the prophets particularly are hoping to see flourish. So it seems more likely that when Malachi says your wife by covenant, he means your wife who is part of the covenant community. I don't think he's talking about the marriage itself. I think he's talking about the women they're married to who are part of that same community, bound by the promises that God made to them, bound by the covenant. That's why, as I said earlier, the problem isn't with foreignness. It's with what in their context, foreignness represented. It isn't just that these people were from a different place, or that they had a different culture, or that they had a different accent. It's that they worshipped other gods. And by intermarrying with them, the people of the community were being led to do the same. Like happened with King Solomon back in 1 Kings 1-11. It's that instead of remaining faithful to Yahweh, instead of staying true to the covenant, Judah is flirting with the daughter of a foreign god. The question for us then is, what does commitment to God look like for us today? And what are some of the ways that we're tempted to go in the opposite direction? What are some of the things that might lead us away from God? Notice, for the people of Judah here in our passage, it wasn't that they were running away from anything. It's the appeal of what lay ahead. They saw the grass is greener on the other side. For us, it might be money, sex, pleasure, reputation, comfort, security, influence, all these things being offered us from every side, drawing our attention away from God, serving Him, loving Him with our all. And what makes them so persuasive, and I think the difference between what we see in our context, how we might apply it today, and what we see in Malachi's context, is that we aren't made to choose. They'll say to us, oh, you still want to have a relationship with God? Fine, do that. You still go to church on Sundays? Not a big deal. Go for it. Do your thing. But they'll encroach on the rest of our time. They'll encroach on our focus and our attention. They'll work their way in to shape our priorities. And although we keep the outward practices going, our hearts are drifting elsewhere. And if we aren't paying attention, what we might just find is that with our focus drifting in a direction, our focus being taken away, we've got this outward shell that's still coming to church on Sundays, that's still involved in a Bible study, but there's no relationship there. There's nothing grounding it. And so, friends, let us throw off everything that hinders us and the sin that so easily entangles, and let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of our faith. Trust that He is enough, that a relationship with Him is worth far more than anything this world can offer. There's nothing inherently wrong with money, sex, security, any of those things. But none of it would be worth anything if it cost you your relationship with Jesus.